Denise Whitaker had canceled 100 things in her life without thinking twice. Dentist appointments, dinner reservations, a gym membership she never used past January. But she had never canceled anything the way she was about to cancel this. Sitting alone at her kitchen table at 11 at night, the blue light of her phone, the only thing lighting up her face, her thumb hovering over a button that would, in a way she could not possibly understand yet, cost her husband $60 million before the sun came up. She would not find out what she had done for almost 3 months. By then, it would already be too late to undo any of it. To understand why a grown woman sat frozen over her own phone that night, you have to understand what her husband, Marcus, had told her only 2 hours earlier. His father was dead. A man Marcus hadn't spoken to in over a decade. A man Denise had never once met in 16 years of marriage. A man Marcus described only in short, clipped sentences whenever his name came up at all. And now that man was gone, and Marcus was already packing a bag, already on the phone booking a flight to a funeral for someone he claimed meant nothing to him anymore. Denise sat there watching him move around their bedroom like a stranger, and for the first time in her marriage, she genuinely did not recognize the man she loved. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Denise didn't know, what she couldn't have known, sitting there in the dark with her husband's travel confirmation still glowing on the screen in front of her, was that the man asleep down the hall wasn't just going to bury his father. He was going to walk into a boardroom he hadn't set foot in for 11 years and either claim an inheritance worth $60 million or lose it forever to a brother Denise didn't even know existed. Marcus had built their entire marriage on a version of himself that made sense to her. A hardworking man with a modest paycheck. A man who complained about gas prices and skipped vacations to save for their daughter's college fund. Every part of that man was real. It just wasn't the whole story. Denise told herself she was protecting something that night. She told herself that a man who had spent 11 years refusing to say his father's name out loud didn't get to suddenly drop everything and run to his side the moment the money question showed up. Because in her mind, that's what this had to be about. Money, or another woman, or some secret she wasn't allowed to see. She had spent years defending Marcus's silence to her own sister, telling her that some fathers don't deserve a second chance. And now here he was, packing a suitcase like the last 11 years hadn't happened at all. So she made a decision she believed, in that moment, was about loyalty. She logged into their shared travel account, found his booking confirmation, and canceled his flight before he ever woke up. She had no way of knowing there was a clock running that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with money. A clock that would run out in exactly 72 hours. A clock her husband didn't even know she'd just reset to zero. What Denise Whitaker did that night in her kitchen, quietly, out of love and fear and 11 years of buried resentment, would not just cost her husband a funeral. It would set off a chain of events that would expose a secret Marcus had been hiding since before they ever met. Unravel a fortune built by a man neither of them had spoken about at the dinner table in over a decade. And forced Denise to ask herself a question she never thought she'd have to answer. How well do you really know the person you've spent your whole life sitting across from at breakfast? To understand how Denise Whitaker ended up frozen over her phone that night, you have to go back almost 17 years to a community college cafeteria in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a 26-year-old nursing student named Denise first noticed a quiet, broad-shouldered man eating lunch alone every day at the same table by the window. His name was Marcus Whitaker, and back then he told anyone who asked that he was studying logistics management because his family had always worked in shipping, though he never said much more than that. Denise liked that he didn't talk about himself the way most men did. She liked that he listened. Within 8 months, they were married in a small ceremony at her mother's church, and within 2 years, they had a daughter, Amara, and a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet subdivision outside the city that Marcus insisted on buying with cash he said he'd saved up from years of overtime. For the next 14 years, life with Marcus looked exactly like the life Denise had signed up for. He left for work every morning before 6, drove a used Ford pickup with over 100,000 miles on it, and came home smelling like diesel and complaining about warehouse quotas and difficult supervisors. He packed his own lunch. He clipped coupons on Sunday mornings out of genuine habit, not performance. Denise worked full-time as an admissions coordinator at Carolina's Medical Center, and between the two of them, they built the kind of steady, unremarkable life that neither of them ever bragged about, because there was nothing to brag about. It was comfortable. It was theirs. And Denise loved him for exactly the reasons she thought she understood. He was consistent, he was present, and he never once made her feel like there was a version of him she wasn't seeing. Except there was one subject Marcus never discussed. Not once in 16 years of marriage. And that subject was his father. Whenever Amara asked about her grandfather in elementary school, the way children do when classmates talk about theirs, Marcus would go quiet in a way that Denise learned early on not to push against. All she knew, pieced together from a handful of short, guarded comments over the years, was that Marcus's father had built some kind of shipping business decades ago, that the business had grown into something bigger than anyone expected, and that Marcus had walked away from all of it in his late 20s over something he refused to name. He never called his father. His father never called him. Christmas cards stopped arriving from that side of the family before Amara was even born, and Marcus never once mentioned trying to send one back. Denise had her own theory about what happened, one she built slowly over the years out of small comments and the occasional slip of anger whenever the topic came too close to the surface. She believed Marcus's father was the kind of man who valued the business over his own son, who had likely humiliated Marcus in some way tied to money or control, and who did not deserve a single ounce of forgiveness for it. She believed this so completely that she found herself defending Marcus's silence to her own sister, Renee, more than once at family cookouts, insisting that some people don't earn a second chance just because they're getting older. She told Renee that a father who chooses a business over his own child forfeits the right to ever be forgiven for it, and she meant every word. What she didn't know was how far off her theory actually was, and how much that misunderstanding would cost both of them later. What Denise never saw, because Marcus made sure she never had a reason to look, was the small locked drawer at the bottom of his home office desk, the one he told her held old tax paperwork from before they were married. She never saw the black card tucked behind his driver's license in a slot of his wallet he never used in front of her, a card with no name printed on the front, the way a normal card would have. She never noticed that his phone, an older model he complained about needing to replace, occasionally lit up late at night with calls from a number saved only as 3 letters, calls he always stepped outside to take. None of these things stood out to her over the years, because none of them were dramatic enough on their own to demand an explanation, and Marcus had spent over a decade making absolutely sure they never added up to one in her mind. The truth, the one Marcus had buried under 14 years of packed lunches and complaints about gas prices, was that his father, Robert Whitaker Sr., had built a regional shipping company called Coastal Summit Logistics from a single delivery truck in the early 1990s into a freight and warehousing empire worth, by the year Robert died, just over $60 million. Marcus had grown up inside that business, had worked summers loading trucks at 15, had been groomed since childhood to eventually run it. And when Marcus turned 28, 3 years before he ever set foot in that college cafeteria, he discovered something about how his father had built that fortune that he could not live with, something involving contracts, underpaid drivers, and a cover-up Robert had orchestrated to protect the company's reputation after a warehouse accident injured 2 employees. Marcus confronted his father. His father told him to grow up and understand how business really worked. Marcus walked out that night and never went back, refusing every phone call, every letter, every attempt his father made over the following decade to bring him back into the fold, because coming back would have meant accepting money built on something Marcus could never forgive. What Marcus didn't do, in all those years of refusing his father's calls, was ever officially remove himself from the company's ownership structure. Robert had transferred a 41% stake into a trust in Marcus's name years before the falling out, a stake Marcus never touched, never collected dividends from, and eventually managed to half-convince himself didn't really exist anymore. He built his entire life with Denise on his modest warehouse salary, specifically so he would never have to explain where the rest of it came from, and specifically so that Denise would only ever love the version of him that had nothing to hide behind. It worked, for 16 years. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, Marcus's phone rang with a call from a lawyer he hadn't spoken to in 11 years, informing him that his father had died of a heart attack that morning, and that under the terms of the original partnership agreement, Marcus had exactly 72 hours to appear in person at the company's headquarters in Seattle to formally claim his stake, or forfeit it entirely to his half-brother David. Marcus had never told Denise he had a half-brother. David was 7 years younger, born from Robert's second marriage after Marcus's mother passed away when Marcus was 22, and David had spent the last decade positioning himself as the only Whitaker son actively involved in the business. David knew about the 72-hour clause because he had watched his father draft it personally, a clause Robert had insisted on years earlier, specifically to force Marcus's hand one day, to make him choose, in the rawest way possible, whether the relationship still meant anything to him. Robert had told his lawyer, more than once, that he didn't want Marcus to inherit anything he wasn't willing to show up for. He wanted a decision, not a signature collected from a distance. And so, when Marcus hung up that phone in his own kitchen, hands shaking, already calculating flight times to Seattle, he was not simply grieving a father he'd spent 11 years refusing to speak to. He was racing against a clock his own father had built specifically to test him, a clock that would determine whether Marcus walked away from Coastal Summit Logistics with $60 million, or with nothing at all. Denise, watching her husband move through their bedroom that evening, with a kind of urgency she had never once seen from him in 16 years of marriage, had no access to any of this. All she saw was a man who claimed his father meant nothing to him, dropping everything to fly across the country within hours of getting a phone call, refusing to explain why the timing mattered so much, refusing to explain anything at all beyond the bare fact that his father had died. To Denise, raw and blindsided, this didn't look like grief. It looked like a man who had been lying to her about something much bigger than a funeral, a suspicion that hardened into certainty the longer Marcus avoided her eyes while he packed. And so that night, after Marcus finally fell asleep, exhausted from the day and confident his flight was booked and confirmed for the following morning, Denise sat alone at their kitchen table, with his open laptop in front of her, staring at a travel confirmation page, and made the decision that would set everything in motion. Marcus woke up just after 5 the next morning, the way he always did, reaching for his phone before his feet even hit the floor, expecting to see his boarding pass ready and waiting the way it had been the night before. Instead, he found a cancellation notice sitting at the top of his inbox, time-stamped 11:54 the previous night, informing him that his flight to Seattle had been canceled and his seat released back to the airline. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen, certain it had to be some kind of system error, a glitch, anything other than what it actually was. He called the airline immediately, standing barefoot in his kitchen while Denise still slept upstairs, and a representative confirmed that the booking had been canceled manually through the account holder's own login, not by any airline error at all. Marcus didn't yet have any reason to suspect his wife. He assumed someone had gotten into his account. What followed was the longest morning of Marcus's adult life. Every replacement flight out of Charlotte to Seattle that day was either sold out or delayed by weather moving through the Midwest, pushing arrival times well past the 72-hour deadline his father's lawyer had given him. He tried rerouting through Denver, then through Salt Lake City, sitting in the airport for 6 hours refreshing flight boards while calling the lawyer's office every hour asking for even a small extension, something he was told repeatedly was not possible under the original partnership agreement his father had drafted years earlier, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of last-minute negotiation. By the time Marcus finally landed in Seattle, he was 8 hours past the deadline, standing in an airport terminal, calling a number that had already stopped being answered by anyone with the authority to help him. Back in Charlotte, Denise had woken that morning to an empty house and a single text from Marcus saying his flight got canceled and he was trying to figure out another way to get to Seattle. She read it twice, feeling something cold settle in her stomach that she didn't yet have a name for, but she said nothing, packed Amara's lunch, and went to work, telling herself that whatever this was, it wasn't her problem to solve. She had made her decision the night before out of what felt, in that moment, like protecting her family from a man who had never earned the right to pull Marcus back into his orbit. She did not yet understand that the flight she'd canceled wasn't attached to a funeral service with a flexible start time. It was attached to a signature, a boardroom, and a deadline that did not care how anyone felt about grief. In a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Coastal Summit Logistics headquarters, David Whitaker sat at the head of a long table beside his father's longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had drafted nearly every major contract Robert Whitaker Sr. had signed in the last 20 years. The 72-hour window closed at exactly 9 in the morning Pacific time, and when 9 o'clock arrived with no sign of Marcus and no word from him beyond a single voicemail left 40 minutes earlier explaining a flight delay, Foss read aloud from the original 2009 partnership agreement, the one Robert had insisted on writing himself, the one stating plainly that failure to appear in person within the specified window would result in full and irrevocable forfeiture of the 41% stake to the remaining named partner. David did not smile, though several people in that room would later say he came close. He simply signed where Foss indicated, becoming, in the span of about 90 seconds, the sole controlling owner of a $60 million logistics company his older brother had spent 11 years pretending didn't exist. Marcus arrived at the headquarters 2 hours later, still in the same clothes he'd worn since the previous morning, to find Foss waiting for him alone in the lobby with an expression that told him everything before a single word was said. Foss explained, as gently as a lawyer explaining a forfeiture clause can manage, that the window had closed, that David had signed, and that under the terms Robert himself had written, there was no appeal process built into the agreement at all. Marcus stood there in that lobby, exhausted, grieving a father he'd never made peace with, and now formally stripped of an inheritance he had spent over a decade telling himself he never wanted anyway. He asked Foss the only question that mattered to him in that moment, which was how his flight could have been canceled the night before it was needed most, and Foss, who had no answer for him, could only suggest that Marcus check with his airline directly. Marcus did not yet suspect Denise. He would not learn the truth for weeks. What Marcus also did not know, standing in that lobby absorbing the loss of $60 million in real time, was that his father's death and the resulting ownership dispute had already caught the attention of a local business reporter named Priya Chandran, who covered mid-sized company transitions for a Seattle trade publication and had been quietly tracking the Coastal Summit succession story for weeks after hearing rumors of a missing older son. Priya had spent days pulling public probate filings, old incorporation documents, and a handful of court records from the original 2009 partnership agreement, slowly assembling a name she hadn't been able to attach a face to until a source inside the company confirmed it for her that same afternoon. The missing heir to a $60 million freight empire, it turned out, was living 2 states away under a name almost nobody in Seattle recognized, working, according to every record she could find, an ordinary logistics job that paid a fraction of what his own family's company was worth. Priya knew immediately she had a story people would want to read. Priya's article ran 4 days later under the headline, "The Missing Heir of Coastal Summit Logistics," and within it she laid out, in careful and heavily sourced detail, everything she had pieced together. A $60 million company, a decade-long estrangement, a forfeited inheritance, and a man named Marcus Whitaker, who had spent 16 years living 2 states away, as though none of it had ever existed. She included a photograph pulled from an old company newsletter archive, a picture of a much younger Marcus, standing beside his father at a warehouse ribbon cutting years before the falling out. The article spread quickly through business circles first, then found its way into local Charlotte community groups after someone recognized the face in that photograph as their neighbor's husband. By the second day, it had been shared into a Facebook group Denise herself had belonged to for years, sitting quietly in her feed between a lost dog posting and someone selling a dining table. Denise found out the way most people find out something that will change their entire understanding of their own life, which is to say by accident, scrolling during her lunch break at the hospital admissions desk, half paying attention until a name stopped her cold. A woman she barely knew from the neighborhood had commented under the shared article, tagging a mutual friend and writing, "Isn't this Denise's husband?" and attaching a screenshot of the ribbon-cutting photo. Denise read the article 3 times standing in the break room, her hands going numb around her phone, absorbing words like 41% stake and $60 million, and forfeited within 72 hours, none of which matched anything her husband had ever told her about a warehouse job and overtime pay. She did not cry. She simply sat down, called in the rest of her shift as sick, and drove home to wait for him. Marcus came home that evening to find Denise sitting at the same kitchen table where, 3 months earlier, she had canceled his flight without ever telling him she'd done it. His laptop was open in front of her again, this time to Priya's article, the ribbon-cutting photograph still on the screen. He knew, the second he saw her face, that there was no version of tonight where he could keep explaining his father in short, clipped sentences and expect it to be enough. Denise asked him only one question at first, quietly, in a voice she barely recognized as her own. "How much of our marriage has been real?" Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment before he finally sat down across from her and, for the first time in 16 years, started from the beginning, telling her everything about Robert, about the accident, about the 41% he had never touched and never wanted anyone to know he'd walked away from. He told her about the warehouse accident that had injured 2 of his father's drivers when he was 28, about discovering the paperwork Robert's lawyers had used to quietly settle both cases out of court in exchange for signed non-disclosure agreements. and about the night he confronted his father over it and was told, without a hint of shame, that this was simply the cost of running a company that size. He told her he had walked away that same week, refusing every phone call his father made afterward, and that he had built their entire life together specifically so she would never have a reason to ask where money like that came from. Because he needed, more than anything, to know she loved the man eating a packed lunch in a warehouse and not whatever was left of the Whitaker name in Seattle. Denise listened to all of it in silence, and when he finally finished, she told him the one thing he hadn't yet considered asking about at all, which was that his flight hadn't canceled itself. Denise told him everything then, the words coming out steady, even though her hands were shaking under the table. She told him about the night his father died, about lying awake replaying 11 years of watching him refuse to say that man's name at their own dinner table, about deciding, in a moment she still couldn't fully explain to herself, that he did not deserve to run back to a father who had never once shown up for him. She told him she had logged into his account after he fell asleep and canceled the flight herself, believing she was protecting their marriage from a man who had already caused Marcus enough damage. She had never imagined, she said, that there was a clock attached to any of it beyond a funeral service. She had thought she was stopping her husband from chasing forgiveness from someone who didn't deserve it. She had no idea she was costing him $60 million. Marcus sat across from her for a long time without speaking, and when he finally did, it wasn't anger that came out first, though anger would come later, in smaller waves, over the following weeks. What came out first was something closer to disbelief, the recognition that the woman he had spent 16 years protecting from his father's world had unknowingly become the reason that world slipped through his fingers entirely. He told her quietly that he wasn't sure whether to be angrier at her for canceling the flight or at himself for never once giving her enough of the truth to make a different decision possible. Denise didn't argue with him. She sat with the weight of that for a long time, understanding for the first time that her own resentment toward a man she'd never met had shaped a decision that reached far beyond either of their private feelings about him. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way their marriage had never been quiet before. Marcus went to work at the same warehouse job he'd worked for over a decade, though everyone there now knew exactly who he was. And Denise went back to the hospital admissions desk, where the same coworkers who had shared Priya's article now watched her with a curiosity she found almost unbearable. They barely spoke at home beyond what the household required, both of them circling the same unanswered question, whether trust, once it turned out to be built on a foundation neither of them had fully seen, could still hold the rest of the house up. Amara, now 15, noticed the silence between her parents before either of them said a word to her about any of it, and asked her mother one evening, plainly, if they were getting a divorce. It was Amara's question, more than anything Marcus said, that pushed Denise to call Gerald Foss herself, 3 weeks after the article ran, asking whether there was truly nothing left to be done. Foss, who had spent 20 years drafting contracts for Robert Whitaker Sr. and had grown fond of Marcus over the brief, tense hours they'd spent together in that Seattle lobby, told her something he hadn't yet told Marcus directly. Robert had amended his estate planning documents twice in the 2 years before his death, and while the original partnership agreement's 72-hour clause was ironclad and had already been executed exactly as written, there was a separate, handwritten codicil Robert had filed privately with his personal attorney, one that had nothing to do with the company's ownership structure and everything to do with what Robert actually wanted for his son, a document Foss had been instructed not to disclose unless someone came looking for it directly. Denise drove to Seattle herself the following week, without telling Marcus where she was going, and sat across from Foss in his office while he read her the codicil in full. Robert had written it 2 years before his death, in his own hand, stating that if Marcus failed to appear within the 72-hour window, as Robert suspected he might, given how deep the estrangement had grown, the forfeited stake would not simply vanish into David's ownership without condition. Instead, a separate trust holding an additional 11% of company shares Robert had quietly set aside outside the original partnership agreement specifically for this possibility, would become available to Marcus if he took concrete, verifiable steps toward rebuilding his relationship with his own family within 1 year of his father's death. Robert had written in the margin of that document that he didn't want his son back for the sake of a signature. He wanted him back for the sake of showing up. Denise sat in that office for a long time after Foss finished reading, turning over what she'd just learned, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't about the 11% at all. She asked Foss whether Robert had ever said anything else, anything that might explain why a man who could write something like that in his own hand had also let his son believe, for 11 years, that the door was closed for good. Foss told her the only thing he could offer with any honesty, that Robert had been proud and stubborn in equal measure, that he had drafted that codicil quietly, rather than call Marcus himself, because some men would rather leave a door unlocked than admit out loud that they'd ever shut it. Denise thanked him, drove to a hotel near the airport instead of flying straight home, and sat alone that night deciding how to tell her husband that his father, in his own flawed and complicated way, had never actually stopped hoping Marcus would come back. When Denise finally told Marcus everything, sitting once again at the same kitchen table where this had all started, she watched something in his face shift that she hadn't seen since before his father's name became something he refused to say out loud. It wasn't relief, not yet. And it wasn't forgiveness either, for her or for Robert. It was the quiet, unsettled look of a man, realizing that the story he'd told himself for over a decade, the one where his father simply didn't care, had never been the whole truth. Marcus didn't say much that night. He sat with the codicil's language for a long time, reading the line about showing up rather than signing, before he finally admitted to Denise that he didn't know if he was capable of reaching out to David, or to anyone connected to that company, without it looking like exactly what everyone would assume it was. The year that followed was not the redemption story either of them expected walking away from that kitchen table. Marcus did reach out, eventually, first through Foss and then directly, in a short, careful letter to David rather than a phone call, one that made no mention of shares or trusts at all. David didn't respond for months. When he finally did, it was to ask Marcus to meet him at their father's grave rather than in any boardroom, a request Marcus hadn't expected and almost didn't accept. Denise drove him to the airport herself that time and stood with him at the gate long enough to watch him board, understanding in a way she hadn't fully understood a year earlier just how much weight a single flight could carry. Marcus and David spoke for the first time in over a decade standing beside a headstone neither of them had visited before, and it was not warm, and it was not resolved, but it was a beginning neither of them walked away from. By the time the one-year window closed, the 11% stake had not restored Marcus to the life his father once built, and it was never going to. What it gave him instead was a slow, uneasy, ongoing relationship with a brother he was still learning how to trust, and a marriage that had been forced to survive the exact kind of secret it was built to avoid. Denise never stopped carrying what she'd done that night at the kitchen table, and Marcus never fully let go of what 16 years of silence had cost him before she ever touched his phone. What they were left with, in the end, wasn't $60 million. It was each other, chosen again, this time with nothing left hidden underneath it. So we want to ask you, was Denise wrong to cancel that flight? Or was Marcus wrong to give her a reason to feel like she had to? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in her place. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, our next story is even harder to believe. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss it.